Okay, thank you. Thank you, Evelyn, for that. Perrin, like we've chatted just before the start of the recording and while our attendees enter our virtual room, just once again, it's great to have you here. Thanks for making the time, you and Divya, to join us and to share all your developments. It sounds as if things have really been very dynamic and productive on your side lately, so that's also always good to hear. So, Perrin, yeah, let's see. I'm gonna, while we wait for everyone to join, just have a quick look at our list of attendees. It's a whole lot. People, if you want to, please tell us in the chat where you're from. We always ask for that. I see Jane from Copenhagen. Perrin, there you are. Samira, oh yes, from work. um, from Sydney.
Wow, look at this. Goodness, now it's appearing.
Cape Town, Mauritius, Rwanda. Ilse from South Africa from work as well. Lovely to see you online, Ilse.
Wow, Pretoria. Goodness, it's moving so fast. There we go. Virginia, USA. Wow. Hi, Steve. I recognize that name. Hi, Steve. Okay, who else we got? Namibia, Zimbabwe, Michael in Canada. Hello. Wow, goodness me. Carl in Johannesburg. Just keeps going. We've got over 100 at the moment, Lindy. I can't quite believe this.
Yeah, I think we had more than 300 registrations, but I think many of our attendees register to watch the link afterwards. So let's give it a few more minutes as people still enter through the lobby.
No pressure on me then, no, Lindy. No pressure at all.
Oh, Perrin, you've been famous now for a while. Toronto, Johannesburg, Durban.
Bloemfontein. Hi, Elna. Goodness.
Cote
I've been
I'm
to
always.
Bloemfontein. I've got family who live in Bloemfontein. So,
Really?
yeah.
Wow. I'm always very excited to also see our African neighbors attending from Gaborone in Botswana, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire.
Turkey.
And then, of
Catherine
course,
from Turkey. Hi, Catherine.
Ireland, Taiwan. Okay, well, I think it is 3 past. How about we get going as the last few attendees join? Perrin, like I said at the beginning, we're really grateful and honored and happy to welcome you back to the GGRF and the GGA, the Good Governance Academy. You've been a friend of ours for a while now, you and Divya through CoSteer. It's absolutely our privilege, and we really look forward to another informative webinar from you and your team today. Our webinar's theme is Inclusivity, a key cultural attribute to decision-making and governance. It's always amazing to learn more about the integrated view you take on corporate governance as one aspect, on business as a whole, and how you acknowledge, the role of people, culture, the human side of things in all of this. So, Perrin, once again, welcome, and over to you.
Lovely, thank you, Lindy, and welcome to everyone from goodness me, many countries around the world. There's well over 100 of you here, so the pressure is now definitely on me to bring you something worthwhile your time. Look, I'm going to very quickly, hopefully, share my screen, and we'll start pretty promptly. So I'm hoping that fingers crossed. You can now see my screen. So very quickly, for those of you that don't know me or CoSteer, my name is Perrin. I'm CEO and founder of CoSteer. We're an organization that specializes in measuring organizational governance and board performance from an interconnected, complex systems approach. And we have this strapline, we say, turning organizations into murmurations. So the beautiful spectacle in the back of the screen here, the murmuration of starlings, We love to see organizations perform like this, and we help organizations understand where they are and boards where they are in that relationship. Inclusivity, goodness, we could spend days discussing it. I'm going to try and give a perspective that we've been seeing and emerging from our data and our research over the last 9 to 6 months that we've been looking at inclusivity. So it's going to be a narrow lens. So if we want to talk broadly, that's fine at the end with questions, but I'm going to be looking through a relatively narrow lens. 3 things I want to try and cover briefly in the next 30, 35 minutes. How inclusivity is appearing to us in being connected to governance. What elements of inclusivity show up as being critical for high quality decision making within an organization, but also at board level. And then really a little adjunct, because obviously AI and generative AI is very much on our radars at the moment. But how is AI enhancing our understanding of governance and its connections with organizational culture? We've been using AI now for nearly 3 years to try and do this. Those of you that know me will know that I always like to start out with a little kind of prompt, a bit philosophical, but fear. I think the world has an awful lot of fear going on at the moment in different realms across different ways and industries and different parts of our lives. And it can emerge as a reaction of moving closer to the truth. And this is a picture of the cliffs in Guernsey where I go running regularly. You can see the fear that I might be feeling looking at that in front of me. But you'll see as we go through this presentation that we've got some fear that's emerging in the world around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's a bit of a backlash that's coming on around it. And I think we need to stand firm and we need to be confident in that. And I think this is hopefully going to help organizations in that process. The world is somewhat fractured. We've got real crises emerging in different parts of the planet, in different realms, environmental, obviously, but obviously in the political realms, business realms, economic realms. And I think the challenge we face is that traditionally our model of research has always looked from a siloed, rather binary perspective. What we've been doing for the last 3 years is we've been trying to look at organizations as systems, interconnected, complex systems. And what this is really allowing us to do is to understand the dynamics that are going on within that system. So we talk about organizational systems, but we also talk about governance because we think those are pretty much one and the same thing. It's a wicked problem. And I use that with a bit of a smile. It is a challenge, right, to look at organizations in this way because it isn't a simple solution. And in fact, beyond that, it's not just about not being simple. It's also about 2 aspects that we need to remember and consider when we're thinking about complex systems. They're both unpredictable and they're uncontrollable, which for those of you that are governance, compliance, or risk professionals out there, this might put a little bit of fear into you. Your organizations are inherently unpredictable and uncontrollable, as is the economic system, as is the climate of the planet. And as a consequence, that could mean, well, why do we bother? Why do we bother measuring it? Why do we bother looking at it? But actually, if you read the second paragraph here, it's because although we can't predict and control, what we can do is be much more selective about how we participate in that system. And I'll touch on that a little bit later on. I'll touch on the butterfly effect and the murmuration of starlings and how we use those to support our own AI. So what's been our approach before we jump into inclusivity? What's been our approach? So we've observed organizations using this validated model of governance. So we look at 3 interconnected elements. The decision-making that go on with an organization. And once you've made a decision, obviously you put it into action, right? Decisions, actions. This is what goes on in organizations 24/7 around the world. whether they're political, business, even in football teams, for example, soccer teams, hockey teams, rugby teams. We make decisions, we action those decisions. But organizations are inherently human. So there is this element we call culture, which interfaces with both of these. And our approach has been to understand these relationships. Can we begin to understand these relationships well enough that we can begin to understand the levers within the system? Not just what we're good at and what we're not so good at, but what are the actual most powerful levers in the system? This has been our approach. What we've done over the last year, though, is we've gone beyond that. We've actually begun to look at how inclusivity emerges from our understandings of interconnected governance. As I mentioned at the beginning, diversity, equity, inclusivity, getting a bit of a bad rap at the moment. And certainly 24 doesn't look like it's going to be any easier for DEI professionals and indeed organizations wanting to follow this approach. And of course, this is because it terrifies a lot of people because the research is somewhat conflicting. Some will say diversity enhances the quality of decision-making and organizational performance, and other research will say the opposite. And a lot of this is because we're approaching these elements as binary. We're looking for linear correlational relationships. And when you do that in a complex system, you will get variance in your output and your results. So very quickly, just really as a reminder for all of us, there are differences between diversity, equity, and inclusion. I thought this was a great illustration of those differences. I'm not here to explain all of these. I think we'll all be aware of them. But I think really what I want to focus on here is we're looking at inclusivity. And we're focused on how it is within organizational systems, people can be given a voice, to be heard, to be listened to, and that their voice is truly seen. There are models of inclusivity out there, different ways of observing it. When we looked at embedding inclusivity within our model, we observed and looked at these, but found them, again, a little bit unpractical, let's say. They didn't really give organizations an insight into what was actually happening within their organizational system. So we developed our own. This is our inclusivity index. We've developed 6 aspects that we observe and measure from our interconnected approach: trust, belonging, psychological safety, openness, equity, and integrating differences. Now, obviously, each of these can be observed and defined slightly differently. I'm not going to go through all those definitions right now. What I will do in a moment is touch on the 3 that are emerging as the most influential on an organizational system, and we will look at defining those. But I need to try and keep this presentation short and sweet, ready for questions at the end. For those of you that have come along to previous webinars, you'll see that we already have an emerging understanding of the influences within our organizational system and the model. So what you'll see is of the top 8 that we see, and there tend to be 8 that emerge regularly as our AI engine is learning. So it's machine learning as well as AI. What consistently emerges in the top 3 is empathic leadership. So the idea that leaders are truly listening to the people within and across their organization doesn't always mean that they agree, but they are truly listening and trying to understand the perspectives. There's a wonderful iceberg model of organizational problems. Leaders know about 4% of the problems that exist within an organization. You go down to the bottom of the iceberg, and the people inside your organization know 100% of the problems. So listening to your people is incredibly important, and we've seen emerge regularly as an influencer on organizational governance. Number 2, embedding values. This is obviously the step beyond just having values on your walls or on your screensaver as you log in the morning. This is about truly living the values that exist in your organization. And new research, I think, that's emerging now is showing the power that can come from connecting personal values to organizational values. So making the organizational values real for individuals rather than just essentially asking them to adopt organizational values, getting them to truly reflect on how they can reflect their own values and uplift the organizational values through them. But we see embedding values as being in the top 3 influences. And then finally, what we call the availability of meaningful information. So organizations and supporting, obviously, decision-making within organizations, the availability of meaningful information. So what do we mean by that? So data is everywhere, but data is meaningless. It's not until we convert that data into information, basically information informing us, that it becomes meaningful. And it's the conversion of that data, that transition, that step between making data information. If we do that well, then obviously we can then make informed decisions based on that information. But if the step between data and information is somewhat flawed, and we're producing information that either isn't clear, isn't meaningful, isn't relevant, isn't reliable, then of course we've got true problems. Of course, there is a step before that, and that's obviously ensuring that the data that we have is accurate, reliable, valid. And so these steps need to be put in place in order to produce meaningful information for decision making. And what we're seeing on a regular basis through our AI and machine learning is that this is emerging in the top 3 and regularly as the leading influencer on the quality of the governance in an organization. What does this mean in practice? So I'm going to just let you read through that while I just talk a little bit around what you're seeing here. So imagine you're in an organization and you're spending money on the right-hand side. All right, you're spending money on training and development. You're spending money on improving your systems and controls, maybe your policies and procedures. You're spending money on identifying a clear purpose for your organization and vision statement. That money might not be best spent. I'm not saying don't spend it. I'm not saying you don't need to do it. But what you can see that's emerging from our data is that empathic leadership is in fact 6 times more influential on the organizational governance of a system than training and development. Embedding values is 5 times more powerful than policies, procedures, controls, and systems in creating a high-performing organizational system. And the meaningfulness of information is 4 times more powerful than clarity of purpose. So I'm not saying don't spend the money on the right-hand side. What I'm saying is when you think about the money that you're spending and you want to look at the performance of your system as a whole, you really need to consider the things on the left-hand side. It might be, for example, that you want to do lots of training and development around supporting empathic leadership. Now, that would be sensible, right? It might be that you want to support your organization in developing policies, procedures, and controls that are not just systems-based, but are values-based. So you can see that these things are not unrelated. So I'm not saying don't spend money on the right-hand side. I'm saying think about how you're spending the money on the right-hand side. Okay, moving forwards quickly because I want to make sure we get all this in. What elements of inclusivity show up critical for high quality decision making? So in our model, decision making is sitting here right squarely, top left-hand corner. It's what most people would identify as governance. We talk about governance in a practical concept. We would say it's about the quality of the decision making. Often it's looked at board level, all right, maybe leadership level if we're really lucky. But what we like to look at is we like to look at decision making across and throughout an organization, as broad and as deep as leadership are willing to look. Because actually, you can imagine strategic decision-making could be of a very high quality. But what if the execution of those decisions, and therefore the decisions that are made at middle management, what if those decisions are poorer? Then overall, the organizational system is not performing highly. Not because the board is not effective in making strategic and good decisions, but simply because the communication between board leadership and down to middle management is not strong enough. That could be one reason. So we look at decision-making as a holistic exercise, not just at board level, although we do support boards in that process. Okay, some words, I'm afraid, moving away from pictures for a moment. Trust. So we see that trust as one of our inclusivity aspects emerges. So there's top three, trust is in the top three, and it rotates. So I'm going to use these three as equals as opposed to one above the other, but I'm going to talk about trust first. So trust is this idea that a person's openness, basically, to themselves and others, and their willingness, essentially, to give another individual the benefit of the doubt. And this can manifest itself in organizations in different ways. The nature of the relationships between the people within the organization. It can look at the emotional connections between people. So the affect-based trust. Do I trust you emotionally to protect me, to look after me, to hear me, to listen to me? And then perceptions of reliability is also a way in which trust can be looked at. So I know that if I ask you to do something, it will be done. So when I return to you next week, I know that that task will be done. I trust your execution of that instruction. So trust can manifest itself in different ways. What are we seeing in addition to that? Psychological safety. So this emerged as a core kind of understanding in businesses quite a long time ago, 1965. I think I went back and thought that this is probably where it emerged from. It probably became most famous, if that's a word, in the research done by Google in Project Aristotle, where they were looking at 180 teams, looking at what made a high-performing team. And one of the principal aspects that emerged from that was psychological safety. So this is really about how much a person believes that others will give them the benefit of the doubt when they take risks. So essentially, the person feels safe enough to be able to express their opinions, and that their ideas will be considered and listened to. Doesn't mean that they'll always be adopted, but they'll be listened to. It'll mean that failure within your organization is an option. It doesn't mean it's what you're aiming for, but it does mean that failure is an option. You're allowed to fail, admit a mistake, and learn from that mistake. And that as a consequence, you won't be punished, penalized, or held up as an example of failure. My screen, there we go. And then finally, the third one that emerges for us as being highly influential on the quality of decision-making is belonging. There are multiple ways of looking at belonging. This is just one, but essentially it's about connection. It's about the modern psychological approach would be attachment. The idea that someone can attach to another person or to a group and feel like they are connected to that person and to that group. And that sense of belonging brings about this feeling of, I feel good about myself as a consequence of being connected to this person or this group. And I'm accepted by this person and a group. Some people say that, I think it's Brené Brown who says that belonging is not about being and fitting in. It's about being able to be who we are within an organization or within a group. So we see these three things, trust, psychological safety, and belonging, emerging as being highly correlated to both the organizational system, but also decision-making and isolation. So just some data really for us to just have a little reflection. So across our data set, we're seeing trust emerge in this way. So a little bit of explanation about what these percentages mean. So the way that we score things is 50% is basically I'm agnostic about trust. So 50% says, I don't think there's much trust in my organization. I'm neither agreeing nor disagreeing with the statement. I'm really remaining in the middle, would be a 50% score. So trust here, what we're seeing across our data set is that generally speaking, there is trust within organizations. And we're seeing that trust can extend relatively high, up to 77%. So this is meaning that essentially on a normal Likert scale, that'd be saying I'm pretty strong in my agreement. Not very strong, but I'm pretty strong in my agreement around trust being existent in this organization. And the percentages underneath, what does that mean? So when we ask a statement, what we're asking is not just someone's level of agreement, but we want to know how confident they are in their answer. And what we mean by that is what evidence have they got to support their level of agreement? So in this instance, what we're seeing is that regardless of the levels of trust that exist in an organization, people are confident in their scoring. Because often it can be used inappropriately by some management. They can say, "Oh, we're not doing well in a certain aspect of our organization," but that's okay. We're going to ignore it because we don't really know how confident people are in that, and maybe they're just misunderstanding things. So expressing people's confidence is a really strong way of helping us understand people's sentiment within an organization. So what are we seeing in psychological safety? Slightly different, because you can see, although the central figure comparing to trust is similar, 63 to 66, you can see the two ends are different. So psychological safety, we're seeing this element in some organizations barely moving from being agnostic. And when people do move, you can see on the right-hand side, 83%. So this would be similarly to being a very strongly agreeing with the fact that psychological safety exists in our organization. And what you can also see is there's a range of confidence. So although in the mean and the sort of lower scoring end of psychological safety, we're seeing relative confidence, 77, 76%. When we're seeing high levels of psychological safety, it's like people are bearing witness to this, and they're really able to express a confidence in the psychological safety that exists within their organizations. And finally, belonging. We're seeing a similar pattern here with belonging as we see it with psychological safety. A fairly agnostic low end, equally confident though than the mean. And then a high end, 85. So we are seeing organizations which are nurturing high sentiments of belonging and connection and attachment within organizations. And those organizations are demonstrating, those people are demonstrating high levels of confidence. They've got lots of evidence to support their agreement with that. So what kind of thing, right? So what? So we're seeing these scorings. We know that these things are related, but how are they related and where do they connect? So what we're uncovering is that these elements of trust, and this is what you're looking at first, connect with an organizational system in different places. So they don't just connect in culture, which is what we would traditionally imagine. Trust is a cultural element, but actually trust comes about in different ways too. So just to highlight this so that we make sure we get enough time for questions, because there's so many of you here, I'm really hoping we've got some questions. What we're seeing is that trust emerges as a factor not only in culture, through purpose and values and the quality of leadership and obviously the behaviors that are hopefully manifested in the values that we're trying to exhibit. But actually we see trust emerge in the quality of the information that exists and pervades in our organization. The transparency of the availability of information within an organization nurtures trust, as does the flow of that information. Is it accessible? If I need to make a decision wherever I am in my organization, whether it's at board and leadership level, or whether it's at middle management, or whether it's simply when I'm communicating with a customer, is the information that I need in order to do my job well available for me to be able to do it? readily available, and can I trust that information? Remember, coming back to what are the key influences on an organizational system? Meaningful information. Can I trust that the information I'm supporting my decision with is valid, reliable, accurate, and meaningful? Because if I can, then what I'm nurturing within my system is a high trust environment. And then finally, across on the right-hand side, excuse me, communication quality, as you can imagine. So the nature and the way in which we communicate within our organization. Are we using empathy to communicate? Are we emotionally intelligent in the way that we communicate? Are we thinking about the method in which we communicate? Is that appropriate? If we're sending out a particular missive from leadership, which might need to be done, do I do that at a town hall? Do I do that through an email? Do I do that through a particular document? Is it that needs to go to everybody? So the way in which we communicate is critical to nurturing trust. And then one aspect which is interesting, operational efficacy, what we call it, but essentially the way in which we're actioning the decisions that we've been made. And I think this is emerging because it's about having trust in the systems that we're using in order to make the decisions action. So this connects with people that are doing, obviously, all sorts of work. Doesn't have to be linked particularly to technology, but imagine the technology, the system that you're using to control your customer database and what have you. Is that system reliable enough? Do you trust it in order to action the decisions that you've been asked to do? If there isn't trust in that system, then the overall trust in your system is going to fall and be reduced. So these are the elements that we're seeing impacting trust. Psychological safety. We're seeing psychological safety emerge, obviously, primarily culturally, which you would completely expect. So this idea, this sense of safety in the values being led in an organization, behaviors that are being exhibited align with values, and I feel safe to express my opinions individually within meetings or maybe collectively within groups. Communication quality, I don't need to probably explain this, but obviously, the ability to be able to communicate and express opinions on that communication safely in a space where I know that my opinion, my perspective will be valued. And then interestingly, in operational efficacy again. So again, it's interesting. I don't actually have an answer for this yet. And we're still uncovering new data here as to what it is within the actions of a system. So when you're actioning a decision, what is it that you need? I think it may center around the fact that you want things to work, you want things to be successful, but is there an opportunity to be unsuccessful and to not be punished for that, not to be reprimanded for that? So we think it's around the idea that it's psychologically safe for me to fail in what I'm doing, the decision that I'm putting into action. But I don't want to commit myself to that because we still need more data to uncover that relationship. And then finally, belonging. I think, as you would expect, the quality of leadership, behaviors being aligned to values. So not just having values and a purpose, but the behaviors and the ethics around that. And the morality, let's say, that exists within an organizational group, be it within a board, be it within a whole system, that those behaviors are aligned to values, and that I can connect with the individuals that are living those values. And obviously these things are interrelated, so I feel safe to do so. And then interestingly, decision maker quality. Now, there are different aspects that we measure within this element. And one of them, interestingly, centers around the use of emotional intelligence in making decisions and understanding biases and differences of opinion. So I think what we're seeing here is that the quality of the decision maker, and we're all decision makers, but the quality of the decision maker, you and me, we're utilizing emotional intelligence, or what we sometimes call ethical intelligence, to support that decision making. And therefore, there's even if my decision differs from your opinion, I feel safe in that decision, and I feel like I can connect to the decision you're making, even if it's not the same as mine. So it's an interesting nuance. And again, we're seeing that emerge. I'm not sure if that's the exact relationship, but obviously, as new data comes in, we'll be able to report more. And then finally, across on the right-hand side, communication quality and operational efficacy. Again, I think these connect to the things that we were talking about before around the nature of communication. Is it emotionally intelligent? Are we seeing emotionally intelligent communication across our system? Because if that is true, then what we're going to see is enhanced connection between individuals and individuals in cohesive groups. And then operational efficacy, again, I think it connects to the capacity within an organizational system. I'm allowed to fail. Doesn't mean I'm allowed to fail every time I do something, but I'm allowed to fail once and I can correct. I can fail again and I can correct. But there's an opportunity for me to fail. And therefore, my connection with the group is not going to be jeopardized because I fail at something. So I think this is where it's emerging. So really, really fascinating elements that are emerging from our model and from our understandings. Very, very quickly, we're good for time, conscious for time, but we're good for time. So really some perspectives around how AI is advancing our understanding. I'm kind of focusing on what we're doing, but I'll take questions around it and see how I fare. But how are we looking at it? So two little stories quickly to begin with. The butterfly effect. So this idea that a butterfly flaps its wings in North Carolina and a hurricane emerges in the UK. We're saying essentially that small changes in one element of a system can cause huge and significant shifts in that system. We think organizations operate in this way. So we think that small nudges within an organizational system can actually have huge impacts on the overall quality of that system. And I think we're demonstrating that with our research and with how we're putting this into practice within boards and organizations around the world. And then secondly, the idea of starlings and murmuration. So this idea that nature, this idea of biomimicry, so us as humans learning from how nature learns to operate within these unpredictable systems that we live in. So starlings and murmuration is a beautiful spectral of agility, cohesion, collaboration. But they do this in a really interesting way. They center around a core purpose, and the core purpose is essentially survival. So their core purpose is how can we maximize the chances of a survival as an individual? And they do that by gathering together in large groups and forming these beautiful shapes. And obviously it helps to see off predators. The second thing it does is it also maximizes the opportunity for feeding. So actually they're a bit like shoaling fish as well. It maximizes the opportunity for feeding as a group. And how do they do this? Interestingly, they do this by referencing themselves to their 7 immediate proximal neighbors. So there's no leadership. There's no single individual or even group of birds that's leading this. What they're simply doing is they're referencing themselves to the individuals that are most proximal to them. And in fact, the number is known, it's 7. So they reference themselves to 7 immediate neighbors. Now, what this is essentially saying, imagine this within organizations, and this is something we want to do in the next year, is we want to be able to observe what these relationships look like. Because as humans, we cannot connect with everyone within our organization, but we do form connections and we do form relationships with a number of people. And what we're beginning to see is that number might look like 7. So there seems to be this idea that the way in which we operate within our organizations and the influence upon us as individuals, how we behave, what the culture we perceive, whether we feel psychologically safe, whether there's an environment of trust, we're not referencing everyone in our organization. What we're referencing is the 7 most proximal people to us. That doesn't mean nearest physically. It's just simply mean the people that we are observing as being most influential upon us. More research to be done, but fascinating. How is AI helping us? Organizations are complex, interconnected systems. Imagine multiple things going on in an organization. You've got purpose, you've got quality of data, you've got the efficacy of your procedures. I don't need to go on. There's lots of things. We measure 27. Some of them are going to be more dominant than others. The question is, which ones? All right. They're all going to be interrelated and interconnected. So you've got dominance and you've got interconnection. So you get this hugely complicated array of relationships and dominance that's going on within organizations. What if we could begin to understand that? Manually, pretty difficult to do. But obviously with the powerful use of AI and the building of algorithms to support our understanding of those relationships, that's what we've done. That's what 3 years have been building. I've previously reported, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we've found that there are 8 out of the 27 are clearly the most influential. We know what those are, and I've begun to talk about those earlier on anyway. And we know the quality of those relationships. So we're beginning to understand what the nature of those relationships, what's the magnitude, not about correlation. Correlation is weak, but can we begin to understand the magnitude and the direction of those relationships? And that's what AI has enabled us to do. It's very difficult to do that manually across different organizations. And then we can build heat maps that help us show what's going on in your organizational system right now. And where are the strengths of the relationships and where are the weaker relationships? So this is giving a heat map of an organization, and it's saying where there's the green, there's some stronger relationships going on, and we can express the magnitude of that relationship. And the red is expressing the weaker relationships, and we can begin to therefore understand and inform organizations on what those relationships look like. So in a quick summary of this section then, so where is AI helping us? It's helping us because it can help us understand these complex interconnected relationships, and we can do it literally within 0.1 of a second. So we collect the data from organizations, from people within organizations, and that data is immediately available to management. And we can do that for boards, for leadership, for teams, for groups, and for whole organizations. We can then inform management of what are the most powerful levers. Yes, your strengths, yes, your weaknesses, but where do you actually need to spend your time, money, and effort right now? So the AI is developing, and we've developed algorithms that essentially produce those for organizations, and that wouldn't be possible manually, or it would, but it would take us months. And then what can we then do with those data? We can benchmark externally between organizations. We can do that internally and show your progress over time. We can do it horizontally across industries and across sectors. So do the systems within a financial services business look different to the systems within a hospitality business? Well, you would expect so. But I don't know anyone out there who knows that answer definitively. We're beginning to uncover those answers. We can look vertically through these as well. So the maturity of an organization. Does the organizational system in a 3-4 person startup look different to a 20,000 HSBC? I would imagine so, but how and where? And we're learning. So essentially each time new data comes in, we're learning how that organizational system is developing. And we're learning across industries and across different hierarchies within organizations as well. So in quick summary, organizations are immensely complex, and that's in itself beautiful. And so our mission is to understand those relationships so we can begin to inform leaders exactly where they need to spend their money, time, and precious effort right now. Because we are living in a world of uncertainty right now. We are living in a world which is fractured. We are living in a world which is truly at a kairos moment. So if we are going to understand the impact of organizations on themselves as systems and then externally and broadly, we have to embrace complex systems and systems approach as a way of understanding that. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to come back to the wonderful audience. Wow, we've actually gone up to 159 people, Lindy. I really hope that I've given value to them.
You certainly have. This is definitely fascinating. Thank you once again, Perrin. And again, there's just not enough time because there's so much more that we want to learn and that you need to share with us. But I invite our audience to connect with you via your website or through the Good Governance Academy. And I really appreciate it. For me, a corporate reputation and a stakeholder researcher, I really appreciate the work you're doing inside the organization. But I'm so curious to how it extends to stakeholders outside of the organization. Providing reliable, audible information to them as well, and sharing values and get them on board as well. But anyways, enough from me. I think we've got limited time left with quite a few questions and inquiries in our Q&A. So Perrin, if you don't mind, please have a look at those and let's start discussing accordingly. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and go through these. I'm trying to look at them in order. So, Catherine, asking, how do you translate empathic leadership? Could you provide some examples of what this means in practice? Cool. Yeah. Okay. So I would describe empathic leadership as beginning with deep listening, right? So it's difficult to give empathy if you haven't truly sat. I don't just mean physically, literally, but metaphorically sat with another person or indeed another group of people and deeply listened to their perspectives. So I think the first step of empathic leadership would be deep listening. And then I would say reflecting. So in order to demonstrate deep listening and to build trust and to build an understanding of connection, so therefore belonging, so if we connect it back to these three elements of inclusivity, I would say reflection. So in order to reflect, you've got to deep listen. So, and then reflect back what you've heard and ask the question at the end, have I heard you right? Have I seen you? There's a wonderful Zulu expression. I think I've mentioned it before in a previous webinar, sawubona. Yeah, I see you, and by seeing you, I bring you into being. So this idea that you're really working hard to see someone. So when you've reflected, that's great, and then an opportunity to share your understanding of that reflection and how that connects with your own perspective. So using the other group or the other individual's perspective and saying, okay, and this is how it relates to my perspective, which might be different. All right. And so I think empathy starts with that way. And then, of course, there's a step beyond that, which is actually into compassion. Okay, so there's a step from empathy into compassion. And I would describe compassion as being empathy in action. So the empathy bit is what I've just described. The compassion bit is the question then, so what can I do for you? Right? You've heard probably, some people talk about leaders that go around in the morning and they might ask on a regular basis to people, what can I do to make your job easier? Right? Well, that is a compassionate, that could be a truly compassionate question, providing you obviously act on it, right? So you're trying to be compassionate. So I would say that's an example, a practical example of how you could do it. What can I do for you right now that would make your job easier? And really deeply listen to the answer. I hope, Catherine, that answers your question. There's another question from Catherine. I'll just have a look at it quickly because I don't want to miss out on the others too. I realize we've got 10 minutes. Some companies in the US are being sued due to their diversity inclusion programs. Yes, absolutely. We're facing that backlash, mostly by the alternative NGOs. I see this happening now due to the increasing conflict between the Democratic. Yeah, so there's a political influence. Absolutely. Has this become a political issue? Just in the US, or is this trend occurring global level? What are the risks for companies other than legal? How can a company? Goodness me, I think we could do a whole webinar on this, Catherine. I think, are we seeing this elsewhere? Maybe not so much, and maybe that's just a position of where the US finds itself at the moment politically. Obviously, the US is still hugely influenced globally economically. And of course, if you get people like Elon Musk, tweeting, you know, DEI must die, then you've got the AI algorithms within social media escalating, obviously, that. So I think we need to be cautious as to, you know, what this looks like. And I think this is, and I don't want to go too deep, but this is why I think our focus on diversity, whilst I'm not saying is not important, it creates challenges for us, because I'm not sure that diversity in its own right increases essentially the equity that exists within an organization, or with any system. You've got to make a much bigger leap from diversity towards equity and inclusion in order to do that. So
Perrin,
we could go too deep into that. So I'm gonna just step away, but I love the question.
absolutely. If I may comment as well, I see that Daryl also asked in the chat. It's a theme that really comes up about the alignment of values between organizations and then, say, employees, or the broader spectrum of stakeholders. And I think, as we see now, like you mentioned, it is messy and fuzzy and murky at the moment, but that's how we figure it out, and that's how we work through it, right?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Right, I'm just going to go up quickly to the questions. Ilse, I'm saying, I hope that's right. Will your research also consider the effects of consequence management at some time? Effect of consequence management at some time, maybe the influence on performance management, trust, and ethical leadership. I'm trying to see if I get the question. Will your I think what we do within the way in which we collect data is we collect data, and we're able to segment that data and look at different levels within an organization. So obviously leadership is different to management. So we are able to sort of look at the differences at different levels within organizations. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking me. So excuse me if I've got that wrong. Lindy, I don't know if you've got a perspective on that.
Yeah, not really. It's basically considering, performance management and then consequence management,
Yeah,
I guess from an HR perspective. So I'm guessing, or linking this to what you said earlier in terms of your system of control must be aligned to your values. So your
yeah.
performance management and actions accordingly as well.
Yeah, we don't specifically look at performance management as you would understand it. And what we're looking at is essentially the way in which people perceive things like living values, communication, but more broadly and generally, rather than in a specific setting. But it's an interesting question, something that I'll get the team to go away and have a think about. Jeff, do you see business and government as having the same principles you've shared with us? Interestingly, excuse me, interestingly, we do have some clients who are linked or governmental. Interestingly, I think they wish to, but I think the nature of the system is perhaps more cumbersome and often more disjointed. So it probably finds it more difficult to move. So imagine the murmuration of Starling's scenario. I think on generally what we'll find is that businesses that are in the for-profit commercial space tend to be more agile and more able to move. Government and non-government and other governmental agencies and things tend to be less able to move. Do they have the same principles? I'd say some of them do, some of them don't. But then there are certainly some commercial organizations that we've seen that don't necessarily share these principles. So I think it varies. As we learn, we might see more data. Thanks, Jeff. Another one from Jeff. Communication is often done by parties who don't comply with the basics of communication being available. How does one address this? Goodness, I could answer a whole thing about that. That's about practically. I hope you'll apologize. I'm going to skip it because we're running out of time. I want to try and get below. I've answered one of yours, Jeff. So Benjamin, will you make the recording? Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm going to say this. Oz minimum. I'm hoping I've got that nearly right. If exclusion in an organization has benefited the owners of a system over time, why should the owners embrace inclusivity? Yeah, I mean, Why would they? Well, I guess the performance advantages within a system may not be observed by those that choose exclusivity. So you're really talking about very hierarchical models within an organization which are dictatorial and don't really embrace aspects of empathy and things. So I think what you'll find is that as the world is shifting and moving away from these models of an organization, that actually the people that work within those organizations will leave. And ultimately that organization will lose intellectual capital, understanding of the business, and then they'll have to train and new people coming in, they'll have high staff turnover. So I think I'm not saying that organizations don't exist like that, because they do. But I think the performance of those organizations in the world that we'll see emerging over the next 10 years will not exist, hopefully. What evidence do people give for their level of trust in an organization? What evidence do people give? Yeah. Also, what evidence is being given for psychological safety and belonging? Okay, so we collect that evidence in the secondary level of the research that we do. So the primary level is through a survey. That survey doesn't collect any qualitative data at that point. It merely collects the quantitative score of confidence. So it's a quantitative score of confidence. In the focus groups that we do in follow-ups, that's where we get the qualitative data. So what evidence that they give, I think it's around, the conversations tend to focus around feelings of being able to express opinions, of being heard, of listened to, of feeling strong connection between themselves and other individuals and or groups, and that their connection to that group is not jeopardized by them sharing a perspective that may be unpopular. So I think it's about the openness of being able to speak opinions in a safe space, is the predominant things that come back from us in terms of evidence, the evidence that they're reflecting on in order to give the score that they're giving. Hopefully that answers your question, Chrissy. Thank you. Jonah, are organizational values just words? How do you force individuals to align their personal values in a world of diversity? Well, I think, Jonah, you touch on something which I just touched on in the presentation, which is you can't force people to adopt organizational values. I think what you will begin to see is that organizational values, those organizations that are effective in living organizational values, are actually going to be those that help the people in their organization connect their personal values to those organizational values. We did a piece of work with a large not-for-profit in the UK. They had 4 organizational values. We did a whole piece of work around how can you develop a program that when you onboard people, they're actually reflective of their own personal values. And what they do is they in their performance evaluation, this connects with a question previously, what they do is they say, these are the values that I'm going to live. They're not your values, right? They're not your organization's values, but I live these ones. And this is how my values are going to lift the organizational values. So suddenly there is a personal connection to the organization's values, and you're not, inverted commas, forcing someone to live an organization's values. I don't think you can. I think what you need to do is you need to understand how their personal values connect. So thank you, Jonah. Great question. Darryl mentions the organizational values must be embedded at the personal levels. Can organizations tolerate unbelieving adherence? What a lovely expression. I'm going to note that down. Unbelieving adherence. Or must all staff now align or convert to the organizational value? I think I've kind of touched on that. I actually think that your way of doing this effectively within organizations is to connect personal values with organizations' values and not end up with these unbelieving adherents. Because actually, if you do that, you won't have any. So hopefully that answers your question, Darryl. Thank you. Damien, last couple. Empathy can be contrasted with charisma. Okay, this is interesting. So kind of personality. You may not have charisma innately, but you can fake it. Okay. But if you fundamentally don't have empathy, remember sociopaths? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 3% of the population. Yeah. Most of them leading organizations. Yeah. How about, sorry, I shouldn't say that. How about a higher percentage in leadership roles? Yeah. Okay. The success criteria for leadership roles need to be tweaked to capture these individuals. Well, you're taking me down a road that I could go on a mini rant, but I actually think that every leader of an organization, every person on the C-suite of an organization should be in therapy. And one of the reasons for that is because I think that a lot of leaders do find themselves in positions of leadership without really necessarily understanding how it is that they managed to get there. In other words, what they can't do is a lot of leaders find it very difficult to personally reflect. And actually the system that we've created within organizations, within many organizations, that allows progression up it. The system actually supports leaders that don't do that to rise to the top. So we need to change the system fundamentally. Yeah, I think empathy is I would say empathy is in fact a skill. I would say you can learn to be empathic. I'm not saying sociopaths, psychopaths can, but I'm saying everyone else can develop and nurture the skill to be more empathic. And therefore, I think it should be a program of training and development across organizations that might help to mitigate some of that challenge. Who knows? Thanks, Damien. Last question, is it? No, Damien. Oh, Damien's got another two.
What last final question, Perrin?
Yeah, I'm going to take Jenny's. Just if there's a question in there, I'm going to take Jenny's. Leadership authenticity is truly reflecting the values of an organization. It's critical to discussion. If not, then the culture will soon erode into one of characterized mistrust. If there is no congruency between personal and most of the organizational values, then surely there would be some concerns about how these values translation and common understanding. Yeah, so I think, Jenny, you're kind of there is a question mark, but I'm trying to work. If there is no congruency and most of the other, then surely there would be some concern about. Yeah, look, it's really interesting. It's a fascinating question. We are right on time, and I know that some people will be dropping off. Do you know what? I don't think I've had a conversation with many individuals in the work that we've done when I've asked them to talk about their personal values, and those personal values have in some way been incongruent with the organization's values. Because I just think as human beings, we innately have the desire to do good, to be good, and to work with others. It's part of our innate need to survive. I don't think the systems that we've created sometimes support that, and I think sometimes that might be incongruent. But I actually think that for pretty much most part, individuals' personal values can in some way support elements of an organization's values. And obviously, if they truly don't, then of course maybe that person might find that they drift away from that organization. But I think there's work to be done in the recruitment process, maybe around what that looks like and how that looks like, to support that process and to avoid that incongruency if it exists. But I would say, generally speaking, personal values will be able to be aligned to an organization's values in some way if those organizational values are truly being aspired to. Of course, the incongruency and a conflict can come where you're trying to live those values and everyone around you really couldn't be bothered.
Absolutely. Organizations can't lie. They get caught out.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Jenny, for your question. And thank you so much to everyone for being here, and those of you that have hung around. We still have 140 people here. So lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lindy.
Okay, briefly from my side and the Good Governance Academy side as well. Thanks once again, Perrin and Divya and your team. It was wonderful to have you here, and clearly there's so much more still to discuss. So we look forward to welcoming you back. But for today, thanks so much and goodbye.
Lovely. Thank you. Bye-bye.